young men started going down with illnesses the doctors couldn't cure.
There was great puzzlement. People would come in with swollen glands, high fevers, fatigue.
Worried calls were exchanged as the first cases appeared in New York and Los Angeles.
They were baffling and they were somewhat scary. They didn't respond to treatment at all.
Everyone searched desperately for a reason, as young men simply wasted away before the doctor's eyes.
I'm really very, very concerned. Several of the patients have died.
Over the next 10 years, millions of people would grapple with fear, prejudice, and confusion. Politicians would dither, and medical science falter in the face of a problem they couldn't unravel. This is the story of that plague. It starts with a social and sexual revolution that began over a decade before. All over the Western world, the 60s were synonymous with liberation. And among the young, liberation was synonymous with free love. But for one group in society, homosexuals, the word liberation had real political meaning too. In the new moral climate, laws prohibiting homosexuality were repealed in some American states. It changed their whole lives.
To be homosexual in 1950 when we were in high school was to be a criminal, evil, and to practice it could get you arrested.
Many homosexuals now saw sexual freedom as an assertion of political rights.
All of us had grown up being told everything we thought and wanted was, evil and sick, and suddenly there's, there is this island of beautiful, intelligent, incredibly sexy men, all, available for each other 24 hours a day. It was truly the linchpin of our sexual liberation, having been sexually oppressed. Well, it was heaven on earth. It was unbelievable. It was obscene in its sheer volume and beauty.
The number of open homosexuals in San Francisco swelled from 10,000 to 120,000 within less than a decade. In New York, young men would meet on the disused piers in the harbor. It was as though they were deliberately making up for centuries of repression.
I felt part of the most extraordinary sexual experiment in human history. I honestly believe this. Never before in human history had so many men had so much sex with so many other men who were having sex.
Fire Island, New York. This is the place they all remember. It became the mecca of gay liberation. Jerry Rosenbaum was a Wall Street stockbroker with a six-figure income. At work in his grey suit, no one knew he was homosexual. On Fire Island, he could shed his disguise and be himself.
The homosexuals had a place to go where everybody else was just like you. And there was a sense of belonging that I had never had before. For the very first time, I felt good about myself, and that having sex wasn't something dirty that I had to hide somewhere. Fire Island was a Belle Epoque for me. It was the high point of my life of coming of age. For the first time, we're in our space. We're on our turf. This is our place. And if you don't like it, get out of my face. You tell me I can't have sex. You tell me I can't even be gay. That's not true. I can be gay, and I can have sex. people came in from everywhere to find out what it was really like at Fire Island. It was seductive. It was intoxicating. And the glue that held it all together was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That was our story.
It was idyllic, but it was already in danger.
It's a sexual smorgasbord like the world has never seen, and a very heavy experience from a liberation point of view, very thrilling to be among all those beautiful men, and it was a very short time before that all came crashing to an end. Just as we had discovered it and tasted it, it took this very sinister historical turn.
In San Francisco, all cases of sexually transmitted disease had to be reported to the health department. In the mid-70s, they landed on the desk of Dr. Selma Dritz. She noticed an alarming increase in the number of gay men reporting sick, some of them with unusual infections.
For instance, amoebic dysentery, we'd have maybe 10 cases in a year, and most of them were coming back either from an ashram in India or Tijuana or in Mexico or something like that. By 75, 76, we were having almost 1,000 cases a year of amoebic dysentery, and they were concentrated 90% in gay men.
The most popular meeting place for gays in San Francisco was Castro Street. At first, Dr. Dritz thought that one of the restaurants there must be the source of so many infections. She ran tests, but they were negative. The other place gays liked to meet was in the bathhouses. Selma Dritz decided to ask questions there as well.
I didn't go into the bathhouses myself, but my inspectors went in, and they brought back reports that would have curled my hair if I hadn't already curled it. They weren't using the baths for bathing, believe me. There was a lot of sexual interaction. You went into the back, there's a big, dark orgy room. It could be 50 or 100 or 150 men in there, all interacting. On the periphery of the orgy rooms were open cubicles, no doors. A nude man would be lying face down on a bed or a platform with an open can of Crisco next to him, and that was it. And he took on all comers, and anything could be transmitted, and it was.
Michael Callan was 20 when he left home. In the small town he came from in Ohio, homosexuality was still frowned upon. His new lifestyle in the big city soon brought its first mild inconvenience, the case of gonorrhea or the clout.
I was still very much a small-town boy from the Midwest, and I felt unclean, and I just felt really creepy. But all of my friends said, oh, please, the clap, no problem. Just get your shot, go back out. It's just a risk you take. It's not a big deal. It's not fatal. By the end of my sexual career in 1980, every single time I had sex, I got something. So at the age of 26, I had to face the fact that I'd had sex with about 3,000 men, and I'd had hepatitis A, hepatitis B, hepatitis non-A, non-B, herpes simplex 1 and 2, Shigella endemoeba histolytica, Giardia, syphilis, gonorrhea, nonspecific urethritis, CMV, EBV, venereal warts.
On Fire Island, New York, that was a typical story. Passing distress, easily cured. But late in 1979, 3 young men reported to their doctors with complaints that did not fit the usual pattern. One of them was referred to a cancer specialist called Linda Laubenstein. Linda was puzzled by the dark spots on the young man's skin and asked for advice from a dermatologist, Dr. Alvin Friedman Keene. By coincidence, Dr. Keene was already studying a case of his own.
A young man who had some peculiar lesions on his legs and on his face came to see me for a diagnosis. I had never seen anything quite like it, and I decided to do a biopsy. And within 2 days, when the biopsy specimen was returned to me with a diagnosis of Kaposi sarcoma, I was quite shocked.
Kaposi's sarcoma was a rare form of skin cancer, normally found in old men of Mediterranean origin.
Another young man came to see me who was perfectly healthy except for these purple-brown spots on his skin again. And at that point I realized that having seen 2 cases in such a short period, that I was dealing with something most unusual.
Dr. Friedman Keene was puzzled. The only clue he had was that all his patients were homosexuals. He knew some doctors specialized in gay patients, so he decided to ask them if they'd seen anything similar.
Within about 2 weeks, I had accrued another 10 cases. Then I decided surely if we were seeing capsicum in gay men in New York, there must be an epidemic of capsicum in homosexual men in San Francisco. So I called a colleague, Marcus Conant, in San Francisco, and asked him if by some chance he had seen any. He said no, he hadn't, but that the Bay Area physicians were having a meeting, and he would ask at the meeting whether any cases had occurred.
And so the next day at that conference, I almost in passing said, oh, and by the way, Al Friedman Keene called, and they're seeing more cases of capsicum in young gay men, which is really interesting. And at that point, Jim Groundwater in the audience put his hand up and said, well, I have a gay man in the hospital right now who's dying of capsicum.
So that summer of 1980 brought the first chill of foreboding to Fire Island. Jerry Rosenbaum was close friends with Nick Rock, one of the first 3 men to fall sick.
I remember must have been in 1980 I ran into Nick Rock. Nick and his friend were 2 of my very best friends. He was a real upbeat type of person. I was horrified. He'd lost a lot of weight. I said, what's going on? He said, I don't know what's going on.
Nick grew steadily worse. Nothing worked.
I remember that every time I held on to Nick, there was a feeling in me that maybe I shouldn't be touching him. And it was like the beginning of the first time that I began to deal with it, even in that limited way. But I always hugged him. I always cared for him.
Los Angeles, on the other side of the United States, also had a large gay community. There, too, a few young men had recently gone down with puzzling illnesses. For some months, a number of gay men had been coming to Dr. Joel Wiseman's clinic suffering from night fevers and swollen glands.
John, I hear some noises that shouldn't be there.
Then things got worse.
The seriousness of the problem comes to light in 1980 when a patient presents with the same symptoms, the swollen glands, the fevers and night sweats, but also with most severe fungal infections infecting all the areas around the fingernails and cake throughout his mouth. He's incredibly seriously ill and does not respond to the normal types of medications that you would give for these funguses.
A month later, another patient came in, but this time with a rare sort of pneumonia.
Pneumocystis carinii pneumonia is a form of pneumonia that was rarely seen, and for a, quote, healthy young individual to come in with this type of pneumonia was unheard of in the x-rays, but especially in here.
That particular pneumonia, PCP, is caused by an organism that's normally harmless. The few who get it are people whose natural defenses are down, like transplant patients whose immune system has been suppressed by drugs.
Just listen to your chest.
The recognized treatment is a drug called pentamidine.
Once the diagnosis of pneumocystis was made, we would get rapidly, like in an overnight shipment, pentamidine, which was controlled by the CDC.
The main job of the Center for Diseases Control is to monitor infectious diseases and track new epidemics. A budget-cutting Reagan administration was at that moment considering whether it was any longer necessary in the modern world. Part of its job was to supply specialist drugs that were hardly ever needed. James Curran ran their sexually transmitted disease division. Late in 1980, he was alerted to an unusual increase in the demand for pentamidine.
Now, until 1980, in the United States, there had never been a request for pentamidine in a person who did not have a transplant and was on immunosuppressive drugs, did not have underlying cancer or immune suppression. And all of a sudden, in early 1981, there were some unusual requests coming in from New York City and Los Angeles of young men with pneumocystis carinii pneumonia whose doctors were requesting contaminating isothianate.
Then another clue from Los Angeles.
To lie back for a moment.
An immunologist called Michael Gottlieb saw 3 of these unusual pneumonia cases.
Okay. It was frustrating to see these patients die one by one, the very first patients, and we had so little understanding of what was wrong with them.
Down the corridor, a lab was using a new test to see how well the body's natural defenses against infection were working. Gottlieb asked Dr. Howard Shanker to run one of these tests on blood taken from some of the young men who died. It confirmed what he suspected. The blood showed no trace of what are called T4 cells, which help the body fight disease. The patients had died because their immune system had broken down completely.
It was certainly a mystery. And what we found was that we were seeing something unique, something that no one had ever seen before, something that no one had ever reported.
The real mystery was what was causing it. Why would men in their 20s and 30s in perfect health suddenly become susceptible to a whole range of microorganisms? Why would their immune systems fail?
It was clearly something new, and Gottlieb was keen to publish first. He rang the CDC and was put through to Mary Guinan, who worked for Jim Curran.
How it has to be done is...
Sensing the importance of Gottlieb's news, Mary told him to send her his article quickly, and she would see what she could do to get it published immediately.
I was very, very struck by the fact that these young men had died. They were dead. They were all dead. And that was what was so frightening. These are young men who had no obvious reason to be dead. They were healthy. And they had not been exposed to anything, any disease process or chemical that anyone felt was dangerous, and yet they were dead, in their 20s and dead. And I sent the information to Jim Curran. When I got it back from him, he had written in the corner, in the margin, hot stuff. And I remember that, thinking, hot stuff, but terribly dangerous hot stuff.
Dr. Gottlieb's article was published in the June 81 edition of the CDC's regular circular to doctors.
Okay, your name again, please? CDC Public Affairs. Hold a moment, please, Dr. Hold a moment, please. CDC Public Affairs.
We were overwhelmed with phone calls from people, especially from the New York area, who said, we have a problem in New York, but we're seeing a tumor, Kaposi sarcoma. Do you think it's related?
May I speak to Dr. Curran, please?
One caller was Alvin Friedman Keene. By now, he'd seen 20 young gays with Kaposi's sarcoma. Some of them had pneumonia and other infections that wouldn't respond to treatment. He was convinced they must have the same basic cause. Jim Curran hurried off to meet him. The last thing he wanted was to start a false alarm. It would probably be the end of the CDC. So the question was, how widespread was the danger?
All the cases in the first few months were in gay men. We anticipated that it was something related to lifestyle, but it was clearly a fatal illness in previously healthy young people and needed emergency measures.
The following month, a few newspapers picked up on the story. The disease got a name, gay-related immune deficiency, or GRID. Most people assumed it was something to do with the gay lifestyle. A few already suspected that something was sex.
I remember breaking into a cold sweat and standing absolutely frozen and knowing that my life had changed absolutely and forever. I recognized myself in the profile of the early cases. I recognized my history of STDs. I had swollen lymph glands. I was having mysterious fevers. I was already having bloody diarrhea and losing weight. And I thought, sexually transmitted disease is fatal. Now there's going to be hell to pay.
The mystery killer had already traveled further than the doctors realized. The 70s had seen an explosion of cheap flights to and from America. Transatlantic holidays had become easy for everyone. And Grid, it turned out, had traveled with them. The first case reported in Europe was in Denmark in June 1981. Paris followed in July. It then surfaced in Belgium, Switzerland, Germany, and Spain. Each country where it landed reacted initially with its own brand of official indifference and prejudice. In Britain, the first case of Grid was reported in December 81. The head of the venereal disease section at the Middlesex Hospital was Michael Adler. He remembers his first case clearly.
Was a young man who had Kaposi's sarcoma, the first case that we'd ever seen, very small blemishes, and he had obviously contracted when he was on holiday in San Francisco. And he died, actually, unfortunately, very rapidly. But I have to say that we were really sort of in the dark. It was the very first case, terribly exciting, very interesting. And I can remember his face. I can remember every sort of skin lesion he had.
The second to die was a young man called Terence Higgins. Britain's first AIDS charity is named after him. Rupert Whittaker, 18 at the time, was his lover. It was Rupert's first long-term relationship, and he has bitter memories of what happened.
I went and visited him, and he was already extremely ill, and he looked awful. He was just completely grey. He was not conscious.
No one would tell him what was wrong. Information was restricted to wives or family.
I was at a loss what to do. Nobody would tell me what was happening, and he was clearly very ill. I felt I deserved some answers. And I was also afraid for myself, because if Terry had it, then there was no reason I wouldn't have it myself, if it's infectious. And I got in, and the curtains around the bed were closed. Well, actually, at that point, they were trying to resuscitate him, because he had just died. The nurses were fine. They were very supportive. And I was taken into another room, and I had some ice cream or something. And I said, could you put this away for him for later? And so they took me into a waiting room and got me a cup of tea, and about 5-10 minutes later they came past. I was dead.
As more cases came in, Michael Adler found that the link with homosexuality conditioned the way people responded.
It was clearly seen as a gay disease, so it was seen as self-inflicted. And I'm afraid that British society, basically, and the medical profession, I have to say as well, are homophobic. And there were tremendous problems getting people to accept that these patients should be treated like any other patients. The experience that we had here at the Middlesex was that it was very difficult to get patients hospitalized. It was very difficult to get patients treated as normal human beings. People were frightened. They thought it was contagious. The patients had to be put in side wards. You couldn't get the domestic staff to go into the side wards. Food used to just be pushed across the floor to the patient. The post used to be thrown in onto their beds. I mean, it was unbelievable. I mean, thankfully that's all changed, but we treated people extremely badly. I mean, it was like sort of medicine maybe 600 years ago.
In America, the death toll among gays was rising steadily, but the response by government was little better than in Britain. In the winter of '81, the small CDC research team still believed that it wasn't infectious. More likely, it was something to do with how some homosexuals lived. Could it be the poppers or amyl nitrate that many of them sniffed as a sexual stimulant? Was it the repeated exposure to sexually transmitted diseases that was destroying the immune system? It meant asking every patient the most intimate details of his life. Mary Guinan was astonished at how they cooperated.
So we had this questionnaire that was incredible. We asked about every possible exposure. We asked about sexual contacts, about what their diets were, what kinds of drugs they might use, both legal drugs and illegal drugs. And this is, of course, a very sensitive issue. And we took it all down because we didn't know whether it was important or not. This is part of delving into something new. When I went to the hospital, I would see how sick they were. It was frightening. I remember first going into an intensive care unit, and this young man who was 20 had tubes everywhere. He was so anxious to talk to me. He insisted, well, I felt terrible going in there and talking to this, taking his last breath, as it were. But he insisted, and this went on for an hour, and with some rest. But he was so anxious, and then he died the next day. I felt terrible. I just thought, here's this child, and he's dead, and here he was trying to help me.
There was little help going the other way. In New York, a small group of gay men began to provide what the city authorities wouldn't. A senior hospital manager, Roger McFarlane, was one of the founders of the group. He set up a hotline in his own apartment.
Then I had 100 calls the first night of people in dire straits, very frightened. And it was like that every night after that. It was terrifying, and no one would help.
McFarlane worked round the clock to get the city hospitals to treat the sick properly.
What shocked me initially was in the finest institutions, the institutions that set the standard for care in this entire nation. People were laying in shit. They were not being fed for days. And the professionals were paralyzed, just paralyzed. I mean, they wouldn't go in the rooms.
This ad hoc group of volunteers turned into the Gay Men's Health Crisis Center. It would become a significant force in the many battles that lay ahead. A vital and immediate task was to help find out how the disease was being spread. Research was still confined largely to individual doctors and a small CDC team. It was underfunded and unsuccessful.
When I had to scratch off names on my infections list because they had died, it was a different story entirely. It became an intense fight to find out what's doing this. It's my job to stop it.
I don't get that.
We didn't know what it was. We didn't know where it was coming from. We had no test for it. Every test that we used came up negative. And so it became the whodunit of the century. It really was.
Actually, there was some progress. A CDC intelligence officer, Dr. William Darrow, was patiently tracking down everyone who had sexual contacts with the GRID patients. They wouldn't be able to tell him the cause of the disease, but they might help reveal how the epidemic was spreading.
We interviewed these two men in the West Hollywood Clinic in Los Angeles. They both named a person that they had had sexual contact with who was not from the Los Angeles area. He had also been diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma. But we really didn't realize the importance of this person until later on that evening. We drove all the way out to Orange County, and we talked with a man who said that he had met a flight attendant at one of the bathhouses and named this person, who was the same person that these two people had named earlier in the day. And that turned out to be the person that we subsequently called Patient Zero. Zero originally was O for out of California.
Patient Zero turned out to be a Canadian airline steward called Gaten Dugas. His job took him from coast to coast in the USA and across the world. The CDC had no one to do the sophisticated computer analysis the data required. So Bill Darrow worked with coins and paper clips to see how Patient Zero connected with all the 9 cases in the Los Angeles area. To continue his research, Bill Darrow needed to find Dugas and talk to him. He was not the only one looking for the airline steward. Dr. Friedman Kuhn had also come across the name, and a chance meeting on the West Coast was to open up the research.
I was invited to talk in San Francisco about this new strange epidemic of what was then called gay-related immune deficiency, or GRID. And I talked about Kaposi sarcoma, and a young doctor came up to me after the meeting and said, I have a date tonight with a French-Canadian airline steward who has Kaposi sarcoma. And I said, is his name Gaten Dugas? And his jaw dropped. And he said, yes, how do you know? And I said, well, we've been looking for him. Could you ask him to contact me?
2 months later, Gaten Dugas responded.
Suddenly, I got a telephone call, and he came to see me. One of the most handsome, seductive individuals I've ever met, and he was enchanted. And indeed, he had Kaposi sarcoma and was initially extremely cooperative.
Dugas agreed to visit the CDC's headquarters in Atlanta. The information he gave the team was crucial.
And he was very open and very honest with me. Again, we had something in common. We both wanted to try to figure out what was making him and so many other people so sick. In fact, it was killing them. So he was very cooperative, and he gave me the names of 73 different people that he had had sexual contact with in the past 5 years.
Bill Darrow set out to track them all down. The search led him to Fire Island, to the group of friends who'd first fallen ill. Gaten Dugas had been with them briefly during the bicentennial celebrations in 1976, when the big ships came to town.
That's when all these people were together. And then they had scattered to the 4 corners of the earth, and all of them had fallen ill. So maybe it was something that they were doing in 1976, when they were together in New York City, that accounted for this horrible disease.
Dr. Darrow worked night after night, contacting and connecting the rest of Gaten's lovers. Since the single common element in their lifestyle was sex, evidence was growing that was how the disease was passed on.
Ultimately, through this process of asking the patients or their surviving partners for their sex partners of the cases, we're able to connect as many as 40 different men. This one patient, Patient Zero, was critical because he not only linked those cases in Los Angeles, he linked other cases throughout the world. It was a very important moment, I think, in us being able to identify the possible cause of the outbreak.
Jerry Rosenbaum remembers Patient Zero, but without recrimination. With hindsight, he was more thimble in the cause.
He hooked up with my group of people. He really did get around. But the net of it was I had sex with everybody he had sex with, so what's the big deal here? I mean, who knew that, though? I never made that cognitive connection. I mean, where did he get it? Where did Gaten get it? I don't subscribe to Gayton being the ground zero person. I had the same lifestyle. It would have come into my group and everybody else's life just as surely as it did this time.
But the evidence for sexual transmission was still circumstantial. The airline steward continued his lifestyle, unwilling, like many others, to believe he was infectious. He went on visiting the bathhouses, though Selma Dritz tried to stop him.
I'd get a report, this guy is in the bath and he's having sex with the others and he's telling him, I've got it. I told him, if you see him again, tell him we got to see him. He came up one afternoon. I was on the phone. When I finished, he was sitting by the desk. He was so handsome. It was heartbreaking. I said, you've got to stop this. You've got to stop going to the bath. You've got to stop infecting a dozen people a night. He said, nobody's going to stop me. It's my civil right. I said, it's not your right to take somebody else along with you when you die.
Grid did not change gay lifestyles overnight. Although there was now strong circumstantial evidence that it was transmitted through sex, doctors were anxious not to encourage homophobia. There was no official warning about the possible dangers of sex. Marcus Conant in San Francisco was one of the few doctors prepared to tell gays what they wouldn't tell each other.
In my own practice, I had men who I was treating for this disease, who were telling me that they were going to the bathhouse that night. And so you realized that even very bright people had reasons not to disclose. I can remember one man, and I said, why aren't you telling? And he said, it's my view that people know that this is the way this disease is being spread. If they want to engage in this behavior, that's their business. It's not my job to be my brother's keeper.
Within the CDC, there was disagreement. Some researchers already suspected it was infectious, but to announce that without proof would have excited unwelcome controversy.
What I regret is that we weren't tougher. We wanted not to alienate the gay community, and they didn't want to hear from us that you can get this from having sex. And so we said, we think so. We think so. We're not sure. I think I would have said now, I would have been strong, I would have said, this can kill you.
Those of us who saw what was happening made every effort to make people aware of it. Marcus Conant did it in San Francisco. I did it in New York. Other people in New York did it. It just didn't take hold. You can't tell people to stop having sex. It just doesn't work.
One person who did try to promote change was Larry Kramer, author and founding member of the Gay Men's Health Crisis Center.
The main message of Gay Men's Health Crisis was not given out at all. It was to spread information, which they refused to do, because to tell gay people to stop having sex or to cool it was such a controversial thing in those days that no organization was prepared to make that statement, and I became a pariah, basically, for making that statement. And for many years, people simply wouldn't talk to me. I was thrown off of the board of GMHC because I said these things.
Roger McFarlane, an equally dedicated member of the same organization, was one of those opposed to Kramer and to warning against sex.
Kramer was right only in retrospect. Kramer was dead wrong at the time. We know he's right now, but he had no case to make. Other than highly, he had predictions which were proved true. I felt there were any number of plausible scientific reasons for this. God knows what it is. Don't tell me you know it's sexually transmitted. On what evidence? Says who? And for those of us who had only discovered our powers, our liberation, through our sexual liberation, it sounded like people were all too ready to say the wages of gay sin are death. It was patently absurd.
Then drug users began falling ill. To some, it proved being gay was irrelevant to the disease. To others, It simply meant that some drug users and gays had the same sexual tastes.
People wanted to believe that you could only get it through homosexual intercourse. They wanted to believe that women couldn't get it, and they wanted to believe that you couldn't get it through any other way except through anal intercourse.
Mary Guinan was sent to investigate the intravenous drug users.
I was afraid. I had a number of experiences with drug users and knew them very often to be violent, and I would interview them by myself. And I would always select a location like a restaurant or a place that I thought was safe. I remember the first man that I saw who was, he brought his girlfriend with him. He had just gotten out of prison. He'd served time for drug use, and many people believe that in jail, men have sex with men all the time. As we went through his story and whether he had shared needles with other people, and he had never had sex and with men, and even under forced circumstances. After that interview, I was convinced that there was a concern about it being transmitted via blood contact.
Mary Guinan went back to argue her theory that it was an infectious agent in the blood, potentially threatening everyone. Jim Curran was not convinced. He felt her informants might simply not be telling the truth about their sexual habits. But down in Florida, a further challenge was emerging to his gay behavior theory. Haitian immigrants being looked after by Dr. Margaret Fischel were going down with the same complaints as gay men, but none was homosexual and some were women.
We now felt we were seeing a similar syndrome, but we're seeing it among those who came from Haiti and who were heterosexual, and therefore trying to piece together what was really happening. Was this indeed an infectious agent?
Dr. Fischel was certain that it was an infectious agent, but she found little support for the argument among the behavior theorists at the CDC.
And we went through the whole scenario of were they really gay, and we weren't getting that information. Was this hooked to voodoo in some way? It was just very difficult, even in the establishment, to break through that this could be transmitted heterosexually. I think there was a tremendous reticence from investigators and physicians at the Center for Disease Control. They did not believe we were seeing what was eventually called AIDS among those of Haitian ancestry.
The reluctance to accept the idea of the new infectious disease was, in Jim Curran's opinion, understandable. The evidence was not conclusive, while the implications were daunting.
We don't want problems to be caused by things like viruses that last for 10 or 12 years, for which a cure and a vaccine may take decades. We wanted to be able to put an end to this problem. We wanted it to be something that was solvable quickly.
The next piece in the jigsaw puzzle was found at the Jackson Memorial Hospital, Miami. It shattered any hope of a quick solution. Spencer Markatos received an emergency call that his father, a hemophiliac, was critically ill.
And by the time my brother and I had gotten down there, my father was basically unconscious. And the doctors were stupefied. They had no idea, not a clue what was wrong with him. He had a type of pneumonia that really would not affect people, would not bother them normally. It seemed as if his immune system had let go, and they had no idea why these things were affecting him so while he was deteriorating so rapidly. It was very frustrating to watch someone you care about literally deteriorate and die in front of your eyes.
The death was reported to Dr. Bruce Everett, who was in charge of the CDC unit which monitored hemophiliacs. The possibility that Mr. Markatos Sr. had been gay or a drug user had to be eliminated. Everett telephoned the family home.
I got a call from a doctor from CDC, and he explained to me at that time that it was something new, and it was the first case they had run across, and they were quite interested in other factors that we may have known about. Well, my father certainly wasn't involved in drugs, or he wasn't homosexual or anything along that line, so there was a question in our mind how he would have gotten it.
It was a question in Bruce Everett's mind, too. He searched back through the records to see if there were any requests for pentamidine for hemophiliacs. It was the large increase in demand for this drug which had alerted the CDC at the start of the epidemic. There were none, but he asked his team to keep a lookout, and they didn't have long to wait. A request came in June 1982. Bruce Everett immediately sent an intelligence officer to investigate.
We then began dreading very much we would see the third case, and sure enough, at the first part of July, the third report request for pentamidine came in from Ohio. By this point in time, we were fairly convinced that we had 3 cases.
Bruce Everett was now convinced that the donated blood used to treat these hemophiliacs must have been infected. In the past, it would have been simple to trace the donor, but now it was impossible, because most hemophiliacs were treated with something called factor VIII, made from the blood of over 2,000 donors. Although the infected blood could have come from any number of sources, including drug users, the sad irony of the situation was that many gay men were particularly generous when it came to donating blood. At the CDC, they were convinced they had found a link between the deaths in the hemophiliac patients and the so-called gay plague, and that link was blood.
These 3 cases could only have been caused by a contamination of the concentrates they had received by a virus. It changed the attitude of all the people who had hoped for or espoused environmental hypotheses. It became apparent to everybody there that we must be looking now for an infectious agent, most likely a virus.
This week's report from the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta reveals disturbing new evidence. 3 cases of the disorder in straight, otherwise uninfected hemophiliacs.
With that news, the words gay-related were quietly dropped from the official description. AIDS, or acquired immune deficiency syndrome, was born. Local news gave it some attention, but there was no firm action. Despite the evident dangers, there was little sense of official urgency that year. No extra funds, no great public warning.
Many individuals at the Centers for Disease Control did wonderful jobs early on, collecting information, identifying what the possible cause was, but something broke down. From that level, the mid-level scientists, up to the policymakers, and then right up to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and in fact, the President of the United States, this barrier came down that said, you cannot do this. And it was that obstacle which occurred in the early parts of the disease and has, in fact, persisted up until the present time. That has not changed. That has been one of the major obstacles to education, to prevention, to treatment.
That's one of the first instances, indeed, of how, a few cases has literally allowed to become first an epidemic, then a pandemic, and now a plague. It's just one of the most horrific stories in the history of medicine. And the people who have blood on their hands, the mayor of this city and the president, Ronald Reagan, I mean, these people are responsible for this plague because they all knew it was happening.
For most people, from those heady days on Fire Island, recrimination like that is too late. The party is over. The band has gone.
It has to be like somebody would feel if they were 85 years old. I still have so much I want to do, and I'm doing it without most of my peer group. They're all gone. Ed White said that every time a friend dies, it's like a library burning down. It really is. The people that tell me that I was here, the people whose face I look in and remember what we did together, all those guys are gone. And there's a part of me that finds that horrific, and I don't know how to deal with it.
programa teve o apoio cultural da Livraria Cultura. É fácil encontrar o livro que você quer.